Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of Mill Creek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing His life, engaging in His presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to episode number 6. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Chris, and our goal in this episode is to deepen our understanding of the book of Revelation in its historical, cultural, and political context through a discussion of the language and imagery that the book uses in its critique of the Roman Empire. We will focus our attention specifically on the images associated with Babylon and also some of the other images that are related to Babylon, such as the dragon and the two beasts that emerge in Revelation chapter 12 and 13 especially. Building on our previous episode, here what we want to do is explore in some more detail now that we've kind of established the importance of historical context generally, thinking in terms of a historical frame of reference within which this book makes sense and out of which it emerges. We want to look specifically at the Roman political context so that we can ground the author's language and imagery and even his prophetic critique within this frame of reference that would have made sense to his original readers or hearers. We're going to try to pay attention both to the Jewish context that makes sense of some of the imagery and language that's used, and also the Greco-Roman context that is the sort of cultural and political backdrop against which the author is leveling his prophetic critique. As we are recording this, our church is right in the middle of a portion of our sermon series and a portion of the book that focuses a lot of attention on this image of Babylon. Chris, you've addressed this in the context of some of the sermons, but could you unpack for us a bit here in this context, in the podcast, in our midweek scenario here? Where does Babylon show up in the book of Revelation? What are some of the main places? And what is the significance of this language and imagery associated with Babylon?
Yeah, John is utilizing Babylon as a means of addressing Rome, and he's doing it in a sense as though this is resistance literature. He's wanting his hearers to resist Babylon. In fact, later in the book, he describes the call to come out of Babylon. So what in the world is he referencing, right? What is Babylon? So, of course, we want to situate it as it is used in Scripture, and then understand the symbol, the way in which Babylon became a symbol for not just John, but even Peter addresses Rome with the moniker Babylon. So, this is something that seems to have been very useful in that latter half of the first century, as there were communications of what it was like to be a follower of Jesus under Roman rule, right? And pretty much everywhere we go in the scriptures in that latter half of the first century, it's all under Roman rule. So Babylon, we just taught on this in our services. A quick recap. First time we read of Babylon is actually in the form of Babel, Genesis chapter 10, then going into 11. And there is this moment when the arrogance of humanity making a name for themselves over and above the name of God, God steps in and he frustrates their process. And the peoples are separated, languages are confused, And so it's very interesting that this is the first use in the scriptures, and this is what we're seeing. But then fast forward lots of years, millennia, and you actually have a literal manifestation of a kingdom called Babylon. And it is the world power at the time. This, again, referencing our last podcast around context, this was so fascinating for me to learn originally. I just didn't know any of this. So when I learned all of this about how essentially Israel became the wrestling mat of the world at the time, right? These empires eventually always got to the land of Israel and took over. So it was the Assyrians, and they were a massive world power, capital city of Nineveh. We find this addressed in the Hebrew scriptures. But then the Babylonians followed them, and these were a fierce people. And they became the prominent empire in that region of the world, and they took over everything. And history records them as a pretty brutal people. They brutalized people. So, and their arrogance was very sincere. Their prominence, their view of themselves was very pronounced. And again, we have some of this recorded in the Hebrew scriptures. We learn a lot from Daniel. We learn a lot from Jeremiah. We learn a lot from some of these prophets who experienced literal Babylon, from their influence and the way in which they treated the people of God to what their life was like, in exile. Daniel's life just being remarkable. I mean, Daniel's just remarkable. Read Daniel, because there's a lot of Daniel in the book of Revelation. Right?
Yeah.
So Babylon eventually gives way to the Persians and the Medes. Again, over hundreds of years, these kingdoms make their way into Israel and make their way to impact the story of the people of God. And that then eventually Rome comes onto the scene. And of course, by the time Jesus is doing ministry, and then the first groupings of disciples, the first churches planted all over the Roman world, Rome is seemingly an unstoppable power. And so somehow the imagery of Babylon became very useful. And it was a way to address Rome without ever saying Rome. It was a way to articulate Rome's many aspects of Rome's rule, from its military might, its way of taking over people, its enculturation of people. Right? Rome wanted you to learn their way of life. They really wanted you to learn their way of life, because through their way of life, they could woo you into a fullness of allegiance to their way of life. That doesn't necessarily sound all that sinister, except when allegiance to Rome meant ascribing worship and things that only belong to God alone to their rule, and to the head or the face of their rule, the emperor. So, John is utilizing this imagery, right? There's so much symbolism going on, and sometimes I feel like we've done the text such violence in taking it so literally. Because I feel as though so many Christians have been on an adventure of missing the point of what really is being said in Revelation, utilizing it just as some future prognostication and very specific, this is that. And when there's just so much life and encouragement to be derived from it regarding what really John is saying, right? So, there's this imagery of the dragon in Revelation 12, and thankfully John identifies the dragon outright as Satan, right? That ancient serpent in the creation narrative. And then there's these beasts that come out of the sea, right? And we're going to talk more about that in another episode. But so he's taught, and then he talks about Babylon the Great. And he's overlaying in his messaging, right? He's taking the imagery of the dragon and he's Babylon and he's talking a lot about the ways in which things we can't see are impacting the things we can see. So, and the imperial cult is really important here. At the point that John is writing, the emperor has instituted worship. Domitian, our Lord, our God. There are shrines or temples to the worship, dedicated to the worship of the emperor, right alongside all of these Roman gods and goddesses. If you were to just try to engage in normal life, right, the separation between the sacred and the secular, as we often like to call it, it just wasn't there. Romans were very spiritual people in terms of, like, if worship makes you spiritual, Romans were deeply spiritual. Frankly, they were more spiritual as a culture than we are. In fact, much more. In their homes, they worshiped their ancestors. In fact, you wouldn't step over the threshold of your home without acknowledging your dead ancestors. You had their masks hanging on the wall. Worship was it. You began your day with it. You ended with it. When you engaged in commerce, when you had some trading of wares to do, when you needed to go grocery shopping, when you wanted to buy a new outfit, worship in some way, shape, or form was involved, because you would do that either as you were eating, you were having dinner at a pagan shrine with somebody that was a business partner, or some of this would even happen at the temple dedicated to the emperor. So the separation, it just wasn't there. And it's hard for us to understand because we really have these hived off, separated. Well, this is secular and this is sacred, and the two shall not meet. That just didn't exist in the Roman world. So just even something as simple as getting meat for your dinner that night could involve a transaction where you would be challenged to proclaim something of ultimate allegiance to the emperor. And as a follower of Jesus, your ultimate allegiance only belongs to one. And of course, we're called out of duplicity in every way as one who follows Jesus. So just the simple act of putting dinner on the table could be if you will, a conflict of kingdoms. And navigating all that. I mean, what John's trying to do for these disciples of Jesus is he's trying to help them navigate their truest loyalty, to garner fresh courage for the tasks at hand, to resist some of the overt temptations of the Roman life. Because that I think we can relate to this. I mean, just think through with me some of the temptations of our culture and the ways in which our culture has just so impacted our normal way of life. For instance, just the notion that we would spend so much time of our day entertaining ourselves. That immediately begs the question, well, how are we entertaining ourselves? What's entering into our lives? I'm not anti-entertainment at all. Look at me. I went buck wild when the Dodgers won the World Series. What are sports if they're not entertainment?
Sure.
Love movies. I enjoy movies. And yet I employ rather significant discernment in what I'm going to allow myself to take in through these movies. I have my boundaries with them. Because one thing I've realized is in the system that I'm in the culture that I'm in, there are things that I can take in that are really quite damaging to me. Really quite damaging to me. And so, when John is talking about the temptation in the Roman world it's not just, listen, some people have been martyred over here and you got to garner fresh strength to stand your ground for Jesus. Part of your standing your ground for Jesus in the ancient Roman world was that there was so much coming at you that wanted your attention, your affection, wanted to consume your time, wanted to be a means of security. I mean, if we don't know where our paycheck is coming from next week, I mean, just let's just think of it this way, right? We're living in a very challenging cultural moment with COVID, and some people are experiencing joblessness. And if we don't know where our paycheck is coming from next week, but there is a system that probably could offer it to us, we just have to agree to do things the way they're doing them. Mm-hmm. It'd be very, very tempting to just, oh, okay. But when that clashes with your ultimate allegiance, it's right then there's a choice. And where am I ultimately going to land in my trust of putting food on the table next week? This stuff is very, very real. I mean, John's writing into some very real life, by the way, stuff where we live. Mm-hmm. It just looks different. It just presents different, but it's the same stuff. Who are we going to trust? How are we going to live based on that trust? How much mixture is there in the Babylon of our day and our faith, right? How much
subtle compromise can one allow?
That's good.
Before one has to be honest and admit, or have a prophetic voice come in and articulate that actually your worship and your allegiance lies somewhere other than Jesus. Right?
Totally. Yeah. Just capitalizing on that. And that's a very appropriate word, capitalizing. Mm-hmm. Again, if there was a system in the ancient world, like a trade guild that you could link up arm with, a union.
Sure.
You could become part of a union, a trade guild. And basically, your economic future for the next number of years would be secure. You're now in a trade. You're now in a union. There's the heads of union. There's a lot of work that needs to get done, and we're going to divvy that up, and you're now in that. So we're going to make sure you have work. Security.
Yeah.
Security. And Roman's economic engine. One scholar I was reading recently, he talked about how originally Rome had to dominate with military might. But then that gave way to their domination actually became less militaristic and more economic because they became so big and so many people participated in their economy. Does that sound familiar, by the way? But so many people participated in their economy that if you hitched your train, if you will, to their economy, well, you'll probably do okay, right? Yeah. So this economic engine was so sincere. And yet, again, if participation in that somehow compromised your loyalty to Jesus, who gave everything for you, and oh, by the way, has said, don't worry, because I know of your needs. But again, let's just admit it. Mm-hmm. It is easier to go the tangible route of a trade guild than it is to face potential being ostracized, whatever that word is, right? Of being excluded from a trade guild, not sure where your work's going to come from, feeling some level of practical insecurity, and yet you're being fully loyal to your truest one. It's just the temptations of the Roman life were so sincere, and these are the same temptations we face.
Yeah. And human empires and kingdoms often function this way, right? They might begin, or they might have certain components of their outworking that are related to sort of pretty much just overt sort of military might or expansion through violence or whatever those kinds of things might be, conquering other nations, expanding one's borders, that kind of thing. But very often when an empire or a kingdom or a sort of dominant political force gains a certain kind of momentum or a certain degree of dominance, or you could even say supremacy, it will very often come to use things like propaganda to promote its dominance, as opposed to just overt military might. It can start to proclaim itself as the entity that brings about salvation for the world, or the entity that accumulates and even provides wealth and economic security for its patrons and for its people. It can, use propaganda to articulate or communicate that it establishes peace and order, while sort of conveniently sweeping under the rug the means by which those things are established, which are all too often by injustice, exploitation, violence, oppression of people. And I think, there are a couple of things that I think this conversation can help us with. One is you've mentioned that this is not, it's not as if one could sort of draw neat distinctions in the ancient world between one's political life and affiliations, one's religious life and worship, and one's sort of mundane activities as they just sort of go about their day. Rather, we might have ways of thinking in our modern Western context that tries to compartmentalize that. But I think one point to make is in the ancient world, they probably wouldn't have thought that way.
Yeah. Well,
and two, even if we convince ourselves we can think that way, we're probably deluding ourselves, and we probably have bought into some sort of distorted understandings of human life, which really is holistic. And these components of who we are and what we do are actually bound up with one another. I think one of the things in this series of episodes, we're speaking about sort of the political and historical and social context of the book of Revelation, and how some awareness of these things can just illuminate the text. An example of this for me that has been really helpful is just knowing a little bit about the use of some of the Greek language in the New Testament, also within the broader Greco-Roman world. It's very easy for us to see language in the New Testament about this is the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ, who's the Lord and Savior of the world, who brings about peace and security for people. All of this language, Lord and Savior, kurios and soter, good news, this euangelion, this good news that brings about salvation for all people, that establishes order, that brings about a kingdom that will benefit people in some way. All of this language that we tend to think of as sort of just spiritual ideas from our New Testament and our Christian theology, all of this language would also be used in the Roman Empire to talk about this alternative object of one's potential allegiance and worship, because Rome saw itself as the center of the universe. The Roman Empire and the Roman emperors were understood as the ones who bring about and establish salvation, peace, security, and therefore ought to be referred to as Lord and Savior, ought to be the ones to whom one's allegiance belongs, ought to be the ones who are worshipped in order to sort of maintain this proper kind of ordering of society. And so the way that some scholars have put it is that not only in a book like Revelation, but throughout the Gospels, throughout the letters of Paul, for example, that there is no sort of neutral space for one who would call oneself or would hope to be a follower of Jesus. If you confess that Jesus is Lord, the implication is that Caesar is not. And perhaps in an especially pronounced way in a book like Revelation, this antithesis or this stark choice is sort of lifts off the page, because the true nature of this empire as a kind of anti-God, anti-people of God force is revealed or exposed, and the crucial kinds of decisions that must be made, not only in the overall course of one's life, but in mundane daily decisions of daily life, that kind of those crucial decisions related to who or what we truly worship and where our allegiance truly lies are sort of thrust in the face, as it were, of the readers and hearers of this book, forcing a kind of stark choice between the two.
you're going to have to cut here. So John, if we were going to try to identify, the good guys and the bad guys,
Yeah.
protagonist, antagonist in the book, clearly Babylon is an image that the book emphasizes as an opponent to God and his people. How does Babylon relate to other forces of evil and destruction?
Yeah, I think the way you've sort of unpacked for us the significance of Babylon as a sort of image within the book is important here, because if John wanted to just talk about Rome, theoretically he could have just talked about Rome and the Roman Empire and emperor worship and that kind of thing. Clearly, the point he's trying to make has some kind of deeper symbolic and theological significance than just saying Rome is bad, we wish they weren't here, or we wish they weren't around, or you shouldn't sort of hitch your cart to, what is it, hitch your cart to Rome's horse or something like that?
Sure, that sounds good.
If that's the right saying. What seems to be intended by using Babylon not as kind of a literal sort of, Babylon's going to become a world power again and take over from Rome, but by reaching back into Jewish and Hebrew tradition and drawing upon this image of Babylon as a kind of, almost as the quintessential image of an empire set up in opposition to God's kingdom. What, at least part of what John seems to be trying to do is say, it's not just that Rome is a problem as one specific kingdom or empire that we happen to live within and be influenced by. Rather, Rome is the current specific manifestation of this pattern that we see throughout our history as Jewish, as sort of the Jewish tradition that John and many of his readers and hearers would have belonged to, and that ultimately has components to it that are bigger and more sinister than simply each particular historical manifestation. So this is where,
that's good.
If we think back to one of the first conversations we had about Revelation, we looked at some of these different possible frameworks for understanding the book. Some would think, it's a sort of future prediction primarily, and so they would want to see is Babylon somehow going to arise again in the future as a sort of as an empire? Are we supposed to be looking out for beasts and dragons and something that actually resembles these? And in contrast to that, a preterist approach, which we defined as an approach that tries to ground or even sometimes limit the possible references of John's language and imagery to its own first century context. If we went with that kind of approach, we might say, this is a veiled critique of Rome, and the point is a critique of Rome. But what many of the other approaches to the book try to do is recognize that perhaps the whole point of using Babylon as a kind of cipher or code for actually talking about Rome is to say that what we're dealing with at any one moment is something bigger than just this one empire or this one kingdom. Each of these particular historical manifestations, from Egypt to Assyria to Babylon to Rome, to even some of the empires within the intertestamental period or Second Temple period, each of these is critiqued in various Jewish and Christian texts as being the type of human kingdom that arrogantly sets itself up in opposition to God, claims godlike status, and demands that people worship it instead of the one true God.
Yeah, wow.
And so the whole point is that, Rome's a problem, and Rome is right here on our doorstep, or we're in its backyard, or whatever image you want to use. But the point is that just like Babylon, just like Rome, that there's something bigger happening here too. And so it's crucial, I think, to understand that the forces of evil are portrayed in the book as Babylon, as a way of referring to Rome as this particular manifestation of what human evil and idolatry and injustice looks like in that specific historical context. But that in behind and underneath and in the midst of all of these historical and any future expression of human political power that looks like this are these sinister forces of evil that are tied to the biblical narrative in all kinds of ways. So this great red dragon, which you helpfully sort of unpacked for us some of the source of that imagery, stretching all the way back to the Genesis narrative, but also weaving its way throughout various portions of the Bible. This language of some kind of dragon-like or serpent-like figure that brings about chaos in some kind of capacity. All of these images are sort of bound up in this dragon figure. And then the beasts are revealed as somehow in league with this dragon figure. And it's important to recognize, again, that without any awareness of context, we might just assume, oh, okay, well, I guess something that's supposed to happen in the future is these beast-like figures will somehow
Godzilla.
emerge. Yeah. But again, these are grounded in existing traditions within the Hebrew Bible. From everything as sort of that there are these abstract ideas stretching again all the way back to Genesis and in books like Job about sort of the sea being a place of chaos and potential evil, and monsters or beast-like figures that arise out of the sea or out of the land as being somehow some kind of vague expression of chaos or evil or opposition to God. But then in more specificity, when we turn to a book like Daniel, we see a very specific source of John's imagery in Daniel chapter 7, where we have these 4 beasts that sort of come into the picture and we're specifically told in this other apocalyptic text, Daniel, that these are representative of human kingdoms, and they each have a particular character to them, but they're not best understood as sort of some kind of literal manifestation one ought to be on the lookout for, but rather symbolic of something, symbolic of a certain kind of human political power that sets itself up in opposition to God, and very often ends up trying to solicit the worship and devotion and allegiance of people. And so, as I think you said in your sermon on Revelation 12, when we begin to see this imagery of horns and these kinds of things already in Revelation 12, we have imagery from Daniel that uses beasts to refer to these human empires and horns often to refer to specific rulers within those empires. And a lot of the imagery from those 4 beasts is sort of kind of coalesces and is combined in the description of this dragon. So the dragon seems to be some kind of representative of that spiritual or cosmic force of evil that stands behind and within any particular manifestation of this kind of human power. And then the beasts, most scholars would agree, come to represent the specific manifestation of these things in Rome. So that the first beast that arises out of the sea is the Roman Empire itself. And the second beast, which arises from the land, is understood to be representative of the imperial cult. And there are a number of reasons that scholars identify them this way. This imagery was used not only in Daniel, but also in a lot of other Second Temple period literature. We've talked before in the podcast about other apocalyptic texts that use similar kinds of language. So, for example, 4th Ezra has an eagle-like figure arising out of the sea and a lion coming out of the forest. So these beasts, which would be associated with empire, arising out of sea and out of land. So these are common sort of images in apocalyptic texts meant to convey something about these expressions of human empire, of human political power and dominance. And one of the really interesting things, I'm kind of going on, but I'll stop after this. One of the really fascinating things about the way that these 3 are portrayed, the dragon and the 2 beasts in Revelation 12 and 13, is they're presented very much as a kind of counterfeit trinity or a parody, a kind of unholy trinity. Not just because there are 3, but if you look closely at the relationship between them, the dragon gives a certain kind of authority to the first beast so that the beast can express that authority in ruling and reigning with its sort of counterfeit, unholy kingdom. The second beast encourages people to worship the first beast. If we think about, there would be all sorts of debate about how developed John's Trinitarian theology is among scholars and theologians. But at the very least, if we think about the sort of narrative of the New Testament, where the Father gives his authority to the Son, and the Spirit sort of enables people to worship, to faithful worship of Jesus, there's clearly some kind of parody here. And it comes down to all sorts of the language that's used. So the beast, for example, is described in one place in chapter 17 as the one who was and is not and is about to go into destruction. A clear parody of God, who is described earlier in the book as the one who was and is to come. There's a point in chapter 13 where the question is asked, who is like the beast? A parody of the angel Michael or Michael. Michael's name is who is like God. There's a kind of parody where the beast receives a mortal wound but then recovers, which can be understood as a kind of parody or a sort of counterfeit version of the narrative of the gospel, where Jesus is put to death but rises on the third day. There are a number of other elements to this, but I think one of the crucial things to recognize is that maybe the two main things, I've talked for a while, so it would be helpful to summarize. I think the two main things to recognize is that the critique in the book of Revelation, the prophetic critique, is not just a sort of spiritual message divorced from the other components of people's daily life. It is a very distinctly political critique that shows how politics and society and culture are all bound up in what someone worships and where someone's allegiance truly lies. And ultimately, a big part of what John is saying is that you can't just pretend or say or claim that you worship Jesus and then allow yourself to be compromised by these systems that are in fact the worship that are in fact immersion in and complicity with Babylon. And when that is revealed for what it truly is, it's in league with the works of the dragon and the two beasts. And so it's this sort of multi-level sort of unveiling or revealing of what's actually going on in these what might seem like mundane situations of daily life, but actually have deep theological and even eternal significance in terms of exposing what we truly worship, where our allegiance truly lies.
It's such a brilliant way to go about it. I'm just listening to you appreciating the book of Revelation all over again. Probably for time's sake, we need to wrap this one up. We have another one coming next week, which is very much in league with everything we've just been speaking, which is we want to discuss next week the mark and the number of the beast. I think that's going to be of particular interest to people. There is, as a pastor, I probably field more questions from people about, okay, what's the mark of the beast? What's that about? And most of us think it's going to be something very, very tangible, practical, something on our bodies. And we're going to have a lot of fun investigating what that might actually look like, according to John, as he's writing late in the first century of the Roman world. So join us next week. But for right now, thank you for joining us. We're delighted that you continue to investigate the world into which John wrote this apocalyptic prophetic vision, and we're having a great deal of fun talking about it. We sure hope you're having as much fun listening to us.
Yeah, thanks for listening. This episode was edited by Tim Muchira. It was produced by Dave Sproul, and we had music from Sherry Muchira.
Thank you for joining us, and should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4s.org for more.